We have a saw here. Guy brought it to me, and it's an older 372 X-Torq that's run for a long time. It is a 2010 372 XP, one of the earlier versions of the X-Torq right there. And I guess the complaint is it's leaking bar oil underneath the muffler pretty badly. So the assumption is that the gasket on the cases somehow came apart. And, you know, face value, right? You know, my first reaction is, before I get all crazy, let's just kind of see what we have. I don't have my camera here, so we're going to have to do a kind of an impromptu with the phone. But it kind of dawned on me that this is actually not a bad saw to dive into for a variety of reasons. One, kind of go back into the whole 372 series a little bit. There's a couple of things about this saw that caught my attention. Huh, look at that. It sure as heck isn't a muffler mod. What do you think that is? And this saw belongs to a guy who does horse logging, is what it is. And it's been one of a few saws that he's used for a very long time. But I just find it interesting, you know, when you look at all the online hype about certain things, that one of the first modifications he made was this one right here. If a person's paid attention to the channel, it'll make perfect sense. And if not, it won't make any sense at all. So I'll leave it at that. More to do what I need to do here. Maybe. So what I'm going to do now is take Makita and start going to town and breaking this saw down. And one of the first things you need to do is to see if there's any gas in the darn thing. Because when I split the cases, whatever's in there is going to come boiling out. Couple things to keep track of. This little top hat that goes like that, it's basically a bearing surface for the chain brake, so don't lose that thing. A lot of dealers don't stock parts like that, you know, so if you lose it, don't lose those. Notice that these are shorter, so they don't poke all the way through the bottom of that handle. Start digging into your case. And get this last one out. And yeah, that's a short one in there. It looks to me like the gasket's just blown out of there. Look at the big old bucking spike it's got. All right, another one to remember is this one right here. That's basically a position limiter. Just a little pin. Fuel line off. Throttle cable off. Pull that off of there. You see that hole goes on that little boss right there. Throttle cable I'm going to pull through some point here and just unhook it from the dam. So now that's ready to pull through. Let me pull the choke out. So basically throttle cable, choke, lever, and I want out of there. All this stuff is going to come off of here at some point. But I can get the handle out of there now. I'll deal with that when I pull the cylinder. You know what the hardest part so far has been for this saw is the heads of the cylinder bolts were completely packed where you couldn't get a wrench in them. Well, I'm kind of faced with a situation that I haven't really had to deal with much before. I think it's partly because of the cold temperatures, but that clutch is not coming off. Not at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this side of the case with that clutch right in there. Let me see what we find on these cases. And it may be I have to force the issue, but we'll see. One thing I also noticed is this one has steel cage bearings. Well, they came right out. Let's see if these cases come apart. You know, and then I may have to put that in a vise, hold those in a vise, and then spin that off. Done that before. So anyway, let me get the case splitter on here, and we'll see what we have in this 2010 version of an X-Torq. Definitely unique for me. Let me just turn this and see if it'll crack. Yeah, it's on there. Yeah, it popped. Do this one-handed can be hard. Hoping it's pulling the crank off the bearing. There we go. Let's take a look at what we have here. Number one, those bearings are fine. And those bearings are stuck in that case fine. So I really don't have to do much here except for put a gasket and put it back together. Can you believe that? I'm going to leave that crank right on there. Nothing wrong with that bearing. This is the very, very first X-Torq I have ever seen with steel cage bearings. And it may have come that way from the factory. Boy, wouldn't that be so cool. See, I think that's factory. I think it came that way from the factory. Yeah, the gasket failed. It failed right along here. So we're going to put another gasket in there. See how you can see all the oil coming up there? We'll put another gasket in there, and then I'll 1184 it and put this saw back together. Now back to the other camera. Let me zoom up a little bit. So, as I was saying, this is a very special saw in that it's a 2010 X-Torq, one of the first ones that got sent over very early on, and the gasket blew out between the crankcase and the oil tank and pushed oil up underneath the muffler. That was the big complaint, and for whatever reason they couldn't get it to run. So it has two problems. They gave me a whole bunch of stuff and some aftermarket ignitions and stuff like that. So one of the things I found with these generation, they've got these plastic locating pins, you know, go right here, right here. Toss them. First thing you do, get rid of them and replace them with the steel ones. And one of the things that happened with some of those plastic ones, I've seen those cases just literally rattle apart. I don't feel the need to do much more than just put it together. The bearings are tight, smooth. The seals look like they're pretty good. I mean, my God, it almost looks like it's been rebuilt on the bottom end. It looks pretty good, so I'm not going to do anything with that. And plus, he didn't ask me to. And in addition to that, he didn't want me to. So all those things added up, we're going to put it together with the components that were in there. But I think I am going to kind of use 1184 just to make sure that I have a saw that's not going to come back to me next week with a blown out gasket. There it goes. I always get these going just a couple of threads. Not pulling with them, you know what I'm saying? I'm not doing that at all. But it keeps the gasket from coming apart or moving itself. So just get them in a couple of threads and not pulling with these screws. I got to stress on that. It's only about getting them started and making sure the gasket is not going to be sliding around in there, moving where it's supposed to be. One of the things you got to really pay attention to on these is make sure that when you're pulling it together that the bearing is actually seated that the bearing is actually seated at the bottom of the bearing pocket. When I pulled this apart, that was the first thing I checked, was to make sure that the bearing itself actually hadn't pulled out with the crank. Especially if you're the one who's pulling on the inner race of the bearing. You might think that the case is bottoming out, but really what's happening is the crank is bottoming out on the inner race. And if you're pushing on the inner race, sometimes you won't get the cases to close up and you can't figure out what's going on. And what's really happening is you've got the crank pushed up against the inner race of the bearing. You're pushing on the inner race of the bearing with your puller, and the bearing itself is not at the bottom of that bearing pocket in the cases. And that can basically confuse people. All right. I'm going to leave that right there for just a little bit. And I am going to run these down. And then I'm going to start squeezing on these and see if I can see the material squeezing. Make sure I don't have a flexed case or something like that, which is keeping it from sealing up. No, I think it's squeezing. Alright, that's nice. Look at that. Look how free that is. So I think at this point I don't need my puller anymore, right? Take it right off of there. It's fairly centered. And it should be, you know what I'm saying? Fairly smooth. And the seal looks good. It's not prolapsed or anything. So let's go and crank on this a little more. I'm going to do a cross pattern. Alright. Looks to me like there's a fairly uniform squeeze. Crank is nice and free. So this guy here has done this job. I can put him away. Yeah, this is one of those interesting moments. What I have here in my hands is a case half from, I might take the camera off and do it with, but anyway, it's a case half off a 2009 372 XPW. I don't know if that's going to show up in the camera or not, but, and if you look at the casting right here, it already had the upgrade that was going to be for the X-Torq. So they had been thinking about the X-Torq way before 2010 because these cases were already in production. And again, this was what would end up being the X-Torq because of the extra meat here and the extra depth of that recess. Now, one other thing. If you ever wonder why I cut the skirt on the X-Torqs the way I do the OEs, all you got to do is look at that right in there and see how much that skirt actually obstructs the lower transfer to know the answer. Look at that. That has a lot of obstruction. So what I do on these is I cut these back just like I do on the standard original edition. I take away that material and it opens up those lower transfers quite a bit. And that along with radiusing the bottom of the transfers and gutting the intake and gutting the filter holder, that's what I do to make these run better, and makes a huge difference, by the way. It's funny, I'm seeing guys, you know, talking about that kind of thing like it's something that's new. The interesting part to me, see, I cut it right back to the, just cut that whole area right out on both sides. So this guy here has a straight shot into here. Radius those back, they flow a little bit better when I do a performance build. But the interesting thing to me, I don't know if anyone's picked up on this, is this case and that bearing had been in production before the X-Torq hit the marketplace, and they came with the steel cage bearings, not the nylons. This is a 2010 version of the X-Torq, and that bottom is tight as a drum. It's solid, no problems. And then I don't know what model year they went from the steel cage bearing version of this case to the nylons, but I suspect it's probably somewhere around 2012. And then we had our famous argument between me and Bob on that whole thing, and one of those things where history is beginning to prove out the premise that I had a long time ago. And that's that when I changed the bearings to the steel cage bearings, whatever issue that they were fighting, be it balance or a machining issue with the bearing pockets or the installation of the bearings, whatever it was, when I put the steel cage bearings in those early versions of the X-Torq before they had a chance to rattle apart, those saws are still out there running. I don't know if one of them had a bottom end failure after I did that. But I also know that an awful lot of that era 372 had rather catastrophic PTO side bearing failures, right? And my theory always was that the nylon cage bearing couldn't handle the additional stress from whatever that was, be it running hot and coking and having to abrade the cages, or if there was a slight misalignment of the bearings, so now they run at a little bit of an angle, therefore generate heat. Maybe an alignment this way with the bearing pockets in the cases. I don't know what it was, but there was something that stressed that bottom end, a little more than the previous versions. And could it be the larger piston? But whatever it was, they failed. And when I had a logger come to me with a couple of those failures, and fortunately for me, he caught them pretty quick. I popped in steel cage bearings and they lasted ever since. And then I started doing them preemptively until it became apparent that you didn't need to do that anymore. Like I said, somewhere around 2017, it was no longer worth doing because Husqvarna had solved whatever the issue was. So from about that point forward, it's like, why bother? Husky already got it figured out. There's no sense in doing that. And of course, the other point was that not all of them failed. Just had a little higher chance if it was a pro level used saw than it was, like a firewood saw or something like that. And there's a whole bunch of those saws that never got busted apart, run just fine. I've got one right here. And there's even some that survived the pro world, so it wasn't like it was every one was going to fail. It just had a little higher percentage, and I saw a lot of them. And like I said, the ones with the steel cage bearings did not fail. This one's case in point from the factory. And then the ones I repaired that still had some tension in the bearing pocket to hold the bearing nice and tight, they all survived. And the ones I did preemptively all survived that I know of in my world. I don't know if that's a sample of 35 or 40, but it was a fair number of them. And then I know Husky changed things, because I haven't seen one with that kind of a failure in years. Literally years. So it's not something worth worrying about if you're buying a new 372, because they've long since taken care of the issue, whatever it was. But when you're collecting saws and building saws from that 2013, 14, and 15 era, if it hasn't popped the bearing, sometimes it's worth just going in there and preemptively doing it like I did, is my point. And if you're going to turn it into something fast, if you're just going to, cut firewood, if it hadn't broke, don't fix it, just run the damn thing. Don't start doing that thought process of doing surgery at that level until there's a reason to, is my cut on that. Some of them will last forever, I guess the last thought about that is the ones that are going to fail probably already did. So, enough of that. That's a whole conversation that really should have come to an end in 2017, except for those people doing junk pile builds. And by now, it's really just an academic, exercise. As, like I said, if they were going to blow, they've already done. They're already blown up. And I just think it's interesting because this is the oldest by model year X-Torq that I've ever had in my shop, and that bottom end is just like brand new. Piston's worn, saw's beat up, but those bearings and that crank and stuff are fine. So that takes away a lot of theories and brings us right back to the simple one. Yeah, it doesn't need a fuel line. That looks pretty solid. So let's go back and do this again. Got the rubber tube there, little bumper there. And you just kind of get in there and hook it on. Alright, it works. But now I gotta find a wire that goes from there, that blue wire. I think I've got one in here somewhere. Let me shut the camera off. So I think the next thing has got the handle on is I'll probably get the tray on, you know, because you gotta finagle stuff around. Sometimes it's a real pain to get this throttle cable up through this little rubber grommet here. There it goes. This guy coming in this hole, and this one in this hole. Get them all right down in there. I know some people think that's goofy, but I like to have a little bit of oil on just about everything. Probably ought to just cover what I did here, because I really had to clean off those cylinder screws quite a bit, and I kind of glued the gasket onto the base of the cylinder, and I set the front two screws all the way through, so I knew the gasket's going to be centered properly. Now the cylinder is not down yet. Let me just pop the camera off. Everyone has their own deal. This is kind of what I do. Like I said, I try to get the handle on pretty quick. But before I settle that cylinder down, you got to take that throttle cable and set it in there, right on that. And then you got to get the pulse line. See it right there? There it goes. So I had to get the pulse line on and get through that intake boot hole, and I'm going to have to get the throttle cable on to that little bracket right there. And it's easier when the cylinder is up. See if I can do it with one hand. Right, and then it goes. So you get that on right there, and then just set it right there. Pulse line through the intake boot. You can see the gasket down in there. And I got the tank vent attached, fuel line coming up through. And then one last thing I want to do is settle the carburetor down onto the anti-vibe right there, and then I'll set the cylinder right down in. And the other thing you got to do is make sure that the tray captures that groove in your intake boot before you get too crazy. And settle it right down. Should settle right in. Not seeing any issue there. Let me get that down in there, and then we'll tighten things up. So again, the throttle cable is now connected. It's in the trigger properly. See it right there? It has to be in that like sleeve. So full throttle function. And if you look here, the anti-vibe is hooked on to the carburetor. And on this side, fuel line, pulse line. And I'll put that on something. I'm just going to let it run free for now. Then the choke, and then I'm going to start tightening down on those cylinder bolts. And now that everything is in there, got my ignition line. I put that on before I put the tray on. So we're pretty much ready just to do the final assembly on this stupid thing. Yeah. Like that little light I got. This one right here. Man, that solves a big problem for me. I've been struggling as I get older to see well. And with that light, basically it puts the light right where I need it. So when I'm doing the carburetor related things on things like the 562 and that class of saw, you know, I have clear visibility about what's going on where I didn't before. I used to struggle with that. So, you know, tighten these cylinder bolts. But I can tell you right now, that's not 26 foot-pounds. It's 23.7, 25. I'll put it at. Leave it right there. So I'm going to actually have to relieve this ignition system because it won't fit. Welcome to aftermarket crap. Man, I hate this. So I've got to go machine just a little bit off the back of this ignition coil. No idea where it came from. All I know is it's a piece of crap. And it's what they gave me to put on the saw, so I'm kind of stuck with it. No spark. What a surprise. What a surprise. No spark. Don't know where he got it. I don't care. But it's simply not going to work. It's just simply not worth fighting with. Alright, let me shut things off. See if I've got a genuine ignition I can put in there. Well, I don't know if it's fortunate for him, but turns out that I do have an ignition. I don't know how good it is, but it's an ignition. So let's set that in there. Oh, look at that. It actually fits. Good spark. Amazing. I did need to put this on first. That little button on top of the cylinder. It's kind of a vibration thing. Make sure that plug wire is away from the fins. Yep, make sure it's up and away from the fins. It kind of is. Oh, it's another one of those. So let me get the handle on it, and then I'll get the muffler on it. We'll fire it right up and see if we have a saw here. Anyone see the humor in this modification right here? Kill switch works. Good compression. This is a good running old saw. Look at that. So I guess there's a couple of takeaways from this little episode here. Number one is don't be afraid of a 2010 X-Torq because it has probably steel cage bearings. Back to that again. I know that's going to annoy people, but it's kind of been a theme now for a while. So don't be afraid of these. The second thing is don't even consider an aftermarket ignition. It's just not worth it on these 372s. I have yet to find one that really, you know, performs. And so that's the second takeaway. Third takeaway is I really like my little light. I love that thing. I can see all in there, and it's really kind of cool. Now I wish I had time to run this saw and retighten the screws, but I don't. But normally what I'd like to do with these is get them into wood for, you know, like a half tank or a tank before I give them back to the customer. And that gives it a chance to go through a warm up, cool down, and then go stick a wrench in all the different holes and make sure I have a final tightening before I let it go away. But the nature of this beast is I'm going to have to let it go the way it is. So I guess I'll just put the bar and chain on it, give the guy a call, fire it up, say it runs, keep your ignition systems, I don't like them.